This is the Roots and All podcast, here to help you get growing. Join us as we explore everything plant-related, both indoors and out, and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Presented by Sarah Wilson.
Hi, and welcome to the Roots and All podcast. This week, I'm talking to a legend in the world of trees, Peter Thurman. Peter's CV reads like a bit of a tongue twister, so bear with me. He's a landscape designer and plantsman and holds chartered status in arboriculture, horticulture, forestry and the environment. He's a fellow of the Arboricultural Association and the Chartered Institute of Horticulture. He's an external examiner for the Kew diploma course and has lectured at the London College of Garden Design since its inception, mainly on planting design, but he also covers numerous other subjects such as soil science, pests, diseases and planting. Peter is interested in all types of plants, from trees and shrubs right through to bulbs and ferns. For a number of years, he taught at the Inchbourne School of Design, Meristwood College, Greenwich University and the University of Brighton. He works throughout the UK and he's completed commissions in Japan, Dubai, Finland, France, Spain, Germany and especially Italy. Although he's based in East Sussex, he now lives and works in Italy as much as possible. And I've seen pictures of his place over there and I don't blame him. And here's the interview. Thank you, Peter, for joining me on the podcast. The first question I've got is, when is the best time of year to buy and plant a tree?
There's lots of options, I have to say. Essentially, you could actually plant a tree all year round. It depends on what sort of tree it is. It depends on the root type that you're going to buy. So, for example, very reasonably priced trees are going to be available in the dormant season, and they're going to be field grown, and they'll be lifted in about November and available through to about February, March. And they're the cheapest type of trees, grown in the field and lifted, what we call bare-rooted. The range then can increase. If you buy larger trees, those bare-rooted trees might be balled up with a root ball, a ball of soil wrapped up in hessian, and they're going to be available for slightly longer, maybe through to April. But the main way these days, especially through garden centres, is either containerised, that's the latter two, put in a container, and sold all year round, once potted up and rooted, or you can now buy container-grown trees, which are available, 24/7. There's only two times when you shouldn't plant or can't plant, and that's when the soil conditions aren't right. And that would normally be when there's a drought, like at the moment, and the ground is rock hard and care might be difficult, or if the ground is frozen in the winter. And again, it's just a question of you can't excavate. Mm-hmm. But, things have moved on since the last century or the century before, and the range of trees and the type of root systems are pretty good.
You did actually touch on something there that I don't think I've put down as a question later on. When you buy something that is field grown and it comes wrapped in hessian, when you plant that, should you take that hessian off?
That's a really good question. First of all, the Europeans do it slightly different to us. Very often you could buy a bare root young birch, but when you get to bigger birch trees, they're going to be root balled. So the problem with root balled trees is that if you don't look after them before planting, they can dry out. And the bigger the tree, the greater the chance there is of doing that. So you can buy a root ball tree and you can plant that. And ideally, yes, you leave the hessian on because that's biodegradable. If you take it off, the soil could fall away. However, the European nurseries, lots of British nurseries buy from European nurseries, they tend to use galvanised wire, especially around the top. And if you don't take that off, then there's a risk, it doesn't rust. So basically that mesh that holds the hessian around the root ball, that mesh will not rust and degrade. Whereas quite a lot of British nurseries do use non-galvanised wire, and that can rust. It's a good question to ask, where does the tree come from? I mean, most garden centres and even most British wholesale nurseries are buying, and I don't think Brexit will change, buying from Italy, Germany, Belgium and Holland. So a lot of our stock comes from there, and they do things slightly differently.
So when I'm shopping for a tree, should I aim to buy as big a specimen as I can afford?
My simple answer to that is absolutely not. Tony Kirkham, who runs the gardens at Kew, and is a good friend of mine, he plants as small as possible, and therefore ideally not staking. The smaller the tree, the quicker it's going to establish. The younger the tree, it's quicker it's going to establish. Now, Kew is an enclosed, policed place. Now, some people may have gardens, front gardens, where if you plant small, there's a risk of the stuff getting nicked. So that needs to be thought about. And of course, local authorities planting street trees, they need to be fairly vandal-proof. But for private domestic gardens, I would say plant as young as possible. Something possibly as little as 1 metre in height. And what will happen is that tree will establish quickly. And let's say you're going to plant a metre-high oak tree. If you plant another oak which is 3 metres high and much more expensive, then actually the 1 metre oak will probably catch up with it and overtake because it gets going, whereas the big tree, the more mature tree, will just sit there. It's a false economy, but it depends, as you know, on the patience of the tree owner. And, they do grow quickly, a lot quickly, more quickly than people think, but some people want instant impact.
So when I'm digging a hole for the tree, is there a kind of rule of thumb about how big and deep it should be? And also, I have heard a rumour that maybe a round hole is not the best idea.
Yeah. There's no scientific proof, but certainly, again, Kew and Edinburgh Botanic Gardens have come to the conclusion that a square hole is better than a round hole. The idea of that is that the tree roots get into the 4 corners of the square hole where there's often a fissure, a crack or an opening, and that gets the roots out and into the soil and what they call into independence. With a round hole, there's a risk that the roots will actually start to go round and round, which they might do in a pot, and so girdle themselves. As far as the size is concerned, I was taught at college many, many years ago that you dig a 50p hole for a 3 bit root system. And so the wider the better. The larger hole you can make, the better. I know some people are going to be restricted, but the wider the hole, the better it will be. As far as depth is concerned, that is really crucial. And a lot of people dig their holes far too deeply. You should only dig the hole as deep as the root system. If you dig it deeper and you disturb the soil underneath, you're going to have to backfill. But what then can happen is that soil will settle, and then all of a sudden the tree is too deep in the ground. And that means the stem of the tree is underground and under soil, and then that can rot. It's one of the biggest killers of trees in Britain is the sinking of the tree and therefore the sinking of the stem and then it rotting.
So I've dug my hole for my tree and it's rained, as it is today. And I've noticed there's a lot of water standing in the hole that I've dug. Is that going to be a problem for the new tree?
It's not a good sign, I have to say. And that will normally occur if the soil is heavy clay or just clay even. And when you've dug your hole, you've smeared the bottom and the sides. So what you've actually created is a sealed bowl, so the water can't escape. So in a heavy clay soil, first of all, you need to make sure that you fork the sides and the base of the hole. That's good anyway to do in any type of soil, even if it's just silty. But then also with clay, I would strongly recommend that what you've taken out of the hole, you sprinkle some gypsum on it. I've personally only discovered this over the last 4 or 5 years. It's an amazing natural chemical. Plaster of Paris is another name for it, and it breaks the clay particles up. It allows the water to separate from the clay particles, and that will really, really help. However, if you're going to plant a big tree in a heavy clay soil, you're going to need a larger hole, and if the water is sitting there, then you might be thinking about creating some drainage, such as a pipe at the bottom of the hole leading to a soakaway. So, in larger gardens, if you're planting an avenue of trees in heavy clay, you might have a drainage system that runs all the way along the avenue with soakaways along the way.
So I've dug the hole, put the tree in it. What am I going to use to fill the hole up with? Just the soil that comes out, or have nice fresh bags of compost?
Right. Certainly not the latter. A lot of research on this now at the moment in America. And what they're saying is that the best thing you can put back is what you took out. That is irrelevant to what the soil type is. Just before I forget, it's not a bad idea to buy a soil testing kit, maybe from a garden centre or on the internet, just to check what your soil type is like. And there's various tests you can do with your hand, and you can Google it. But, if you can roll your soil up into a ball, then the chances are it's very clay. If it doesn't form a ball and it falls apart, then it's quite sandy. But the soil testing kit will also tell you about the pH, the acidity or alkalinity, and that's quite important to know as well, as far as tree selection is concerned. Put back what you have taken out. If it's clay, gypsum, maybe a little bit of coarse grit as well. But the research in America suggests that no more than 10% tree planting compost or compost from your compost bin.
Okay. And anything in the way of feeds?
The chances are, regardless of the sort of tree that you've planted, containerised, container-grown, root ball, bare root, the roots are going to be damaged. You need to damage the roots. If you're buying a containerised or container-grown tree, it's a good idea, despite what the magazines and the television say, you need to damage the root system. If you've got girdling of the roots, spiralling of the roots when you take the tree out of the pot, then you need to cut that. You need to damage those roots. That's one of the most important things to do. Therefore, the tree is in no fit state to take any fertiliser up. It's going to live off its sugars, its reserves in its twigs and stem for the first 2 or 3 years. If I was going to feed a tree, I would feed it in year 3.
Okay.
There are loads of other proprietary things, I can only describe them as things on the market, which are being sold, commercial products, and most of them are snake oil, and they are rubbish and a waste of time. And that includes some products that are endorsed by fairly important organisations in Britain, sadly. But the main one that I have very great misgivings about are mycorrhizal inoculants. Mycorrhizal is an important thing in the wild. It's completely vital to trees in the wild, but you can't buy a packet of it and expect it to work with a tree that you're going to plant in a garden. It's a load of rubbish. There are other things that are also now considered to be a waste of money, things like seaweed extract, etc. But there is some research that suggests, and I suggest your listeners Google biochar, which is basically heavily burnt charcoal, which is a soil sweetener. There's a new product out called Rigel G, which is proving very good in trials. And also, don't laugh, but Tate and Lyle, sugar. When you think about it, it's sucrose. And sugar is a good feeder, but I would still not do that until year 3.
Okay. I think that's what Glyn Percival's been looking into, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sugar thing.
Reading University.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's really, really brilliant to know, I think, in terms of saving money, if nothing else. I wonder if you could talk about clay, soil, and the idea of putting a layer of grit down in the planting hole before you put the tree on it. Is that something you should do?
It's all going to help. Yeah,
right.
Coarse grit, sharp grit is, and what I would do is actually mix that with the clay before you put it back in the soil. There's another important thing with clay is if you're going to try and plant when the clay is dry, that's going to be very difficult because it's going to form blocks. And if it's really, really wet, it's going to be very claggy and it's going to be difficult to use that as a backfill and to firm it properly. So timing is important, not too wet, not too dry. But a coarse grit is great. And also possibly as a layer in the bottom, especially if it's involved with a drainage system like I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So once we've planted the tree and filled the hole, should we then water it? And should we water it even if it's raining out? I mean, is that a daft idea?
If I was going to plant a bare root plant, if I'd left it overnight, preferably in a polythene bag in a shed, I'd probably still dunk that in a water butt for about 20 minutes before planting. Also, if you're planting a container-grown plant and maybe you've let it dry out, you could dunk that in a butt and until the bubbles come to the surface so that you know that the rooting system is nice and moist. And then you can't really rely on rain unless we have a monsoon for a week. I would always water in a tree at the time of planting, and that helps the soil settle down through the fibrous roots, etc. So I would always water. There's some research recently in America has shown that the average mature tree in the summer is possibly looking for 100 litres of water a day. What you've led me on to is that the most important thing to do with trees once you've planted them is to water them. You just got to water them in the first year. After that, I don't think it's so important. Even after a drought like we've had for the last 10 weeks here, I've watered some of my trees, but that's the first time I can remember a summer like this since 1976. And one of the problems with irrigation systems that some contractors suggest is that if it's not worked properly or rigged up properly, then an irrigation system can overwater a tree, which is just as bad as the tree drying out in a drought.
I know a lot of people water, but they don't understand the importance of actually giving a tree a really good drink. So I know this is how long is a piece of string, really, but if I were to stand there with a hose pipe in my hand, would 30 seconds kind of be enough, or how long are we talking, really?
Especially in a hot summer, what happens is that if you water a tree for 30 seconds that you've just planted, a lot of that water will evaporate. A lot of the water won't go down very deeply, and therefore you're going to be encouraging surface rooting, which is even more prone to drying out. So a good soak once or twice a week is far better than little and often.
And the other thing that I noticed in my garden this year, in this incredibly hot summer, is that most of my established plants, and that includes the trees and the perennials, are okay. They've obviously got to the point where they've got the roots down and they've got away, and that's fine. But with newly planted trees, how many years do you think in would you be looking to supplement the water for if it was a hot year? Okay,
let's hope that we don't have another summer like this for another 30 odd years. With climate change, if this becomes normal, then subject to hosepipe bans, I think quite a lot of trees might need some help if we have these 10-week droughts. I mean, climate change is going to be about bigger weather events, which means we're going to get monsoons like we've had today and yesterday. So it's a little bit unpredictable, but generally I would say that most hardy trees that grow in the Northern Hemisphere should not need supplementary watering after the first year. The only time would be if we have really exceptional conditions. I mean, as you can see out of my window, there's a cornice over there, and that's shedding leaves. And that's another thing that trees will do to try and reduce water uptake. They'll do stuff. They'll die back a bit. They'll shed their leaves. All plants have wonderful mechanisms.
We're surrounded by oak woodland, and the oaks are starting to shed their leaves.
Yeah.
So when I've planted my tree, will it need staking?
If you plant young, then no. Anything taller than maybe 1.5 metres in height, and if you're in an exposed position, then you're going to have to consider staking. Oblique or diagonal staking is only really useful on terraces or sloping soils. A single stake should suffice. If the tree you're planting is really quite large, then a double stake with a crossbar, and underground staking or supports using cable is also considered to be okay, although a lot of people are moving away from that now because some of the companies are not using biodegradable wire. So again, you're back to the same problem. My quick answer would be no, don't stake if you don't have to, because what happens is that the tree can rely on the staking and not put on its own muscle. If you are going to stake a tree, then the stake should be in the ground and above ground 1/3 of the height of the tree overall. That's, again, some research suggests that if you stake a third of the height of the tree, then that should suffice. And the really important thing is to get rid of that stake as soon as possible. Don't leave it on, not only because the ties might rub on the bark, but you really want the tree to become independent. And the idea of the stake is to stop it rocking sideways. But once the roots get going, then the tree is stable, stabilised, secure, and the stake should go, and the tie.
Okay, and in terms of the tie, what can happen if you leave that in place for too long?
It depends on what sort of tie, but some ties are a little bit expandable and they will stretch as the tree grows. But some of the proprietary products on the market are not, and they will dig into the bark and eventually cause damage to the cambium underneath the bark, the plumbing.
What should we do with the soil around the trunk of a tree? Should we leave it bare? A lot of people like the look of grass growing up to a tree. Is that an ideal situation?
If I was to suggest just one thing to do when you plant a tree, it's to mulch. Mulching is by far the most important thing. That can be bark chips. It could be compost from your compost heap. It might be wood chips from a local tree surgeon who often want to get rid of the stuff because they have to pay to dump it. There's lots of different possibilities out there. But mulching does so many wonderful things. It keeps the moisture in the ground. It makes the soil temperature more ambient throughout the year. It suppresses weed competition. I could give you a list of 20 things that mulching does. It needs to be about 3 or 4 inches, maybe 10 centimetres in depth, but with a little gully around the stem because you don't want to cover the stem. A metre diameter would be wonderful, but even a 60 centimetres diameter would be better than nothing. And if the tree's planted in a lawn, then if you kept that mulch going for 2 years, preferably 3, after that, yes, the lawn can be allowed to grow right up to the tree. But mulching is just a fantastic thing to do. It's so important. At Kew, they're now mulching some of the mature trees right out to the crown. And that's doing so many different things, reducing compaction, encouraging microbial organisms in, even mycorrhizal fungi flying in without buying a packet of it. It's arriving because you're creating an environment that is great for soil fauna and mycorrhizal fungi.
We may have covered everything, I suspect, but is there anything else that you can think of that would give a new tree a good start in life?
Most nurseries will formatively prune their trees in the nursery, but sometimes you may find that you buy a tree, get it home and realise that some of the branches are dead. Maybe you've damaged it in the car on the way home and there's some broken branches. There might be crossing and rubbing branches, and you could do what they call formative pruning. Ideally, the nursery should do it, and you can always ask them to do it before you purchase it. But getting decent air circulation and a good form of the crown when the tree's young is a great idea. And that one of the things that will do is avoid big problems later on. So if you've got a double leader, but the tree you want is an upright tree, then removing one of the competitive leaders is a good idea. And if there are any really narrow forks, which may, when the trees mature, become weak and defective, that's the sort of thing that I would suggest with formative pruning. To summarise, when you plant a tree, year 1, water, year 2, remove the stake, year 3, feed if you think you need to.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So I get a lot of people asking me about sort of certain species that they can plant for certain effects. And I've heard you speak a number of times, and you always recommend really good trees that people might not have thought of. So just a few quick questions really about different trees for different places. Okay. What is a good tree that has an upright shape and won't spread out too wide? A lot of people kind of want the height, but they don't want the width of a tree. Yeah.
If you're looking in a book or a catalogue, then look for the word fastigiata or erecta. So Latin name genus, Latin name species. And then a lot of trees that we plant for ornamentation are cultivated varieties. And the third word is often fastigiata or erecta, and that means upright, basically. So picking any tree that's fastigiate will give you a narrow crown, sort of a wine glass shaped crown, suitable for small gardens. The ones that you'll tend to find in garden centres mainly are members of the rose family. It's a big family, but apples, pears, plums, rowans, white beams, they're all in the Rosaceae family. And there's a lot of fastigiate trees within those genera. And, they're all okay. Flowering cherries as well, again in the rose family. They're a good bet, but there are so many other trees around which are a bit more unusual, which are also upright. Mm-hmm. For example, you might be able to see it in my garden. There's a Coleruteria, pride of India tree just beyond the dogwood. That's Coleruteria paniculata fastigiata, and that's just one of many out there that you could it's just worth looking a little bit beyond the obvious.
Yeah, okay. If I had a really small garden and I just had room for kind of maybe one tree, what would be a good one?
Well, an interesting thing that one particular nursery up in Cambridgeshire are doing is actually growing shrubs into trees. Clear-stemmed or not clear-stemmed, but there's a lot of shrub genera like holly and some of the smaller magnolias that they're now growing as trees. And in a small garden, I think a shrub grown as a tree. And remember that the term tree and the term shrub are not botanical terms. They're not structural botany terms. They're horticultural terms. And you can keep trees as shrubs and you can grow shrubs into trees. And that might be worth looking at is some varieties of holly, magnolias, even quite exotic things like hibiscus are now being grown as trees.
Okay. Now, I know what my answer to this question would be, but if I had a huge, great big garden, what do you think is a really large tree with a real wow factor?
We're spoilt for choice again. Not all oaks are suffering from the various horrible problems that are around at the moment. Ash is really not available now because of the main pathogen, that Chalara, which is now affecting ash. You can't buy it anymore. There are some wonderful oaks. I mean, there are over 450 species of oak on the planet. And, go to a good nursery, go to a good plant centre, and they'll be there. And they don't all get this horrible oak processionary moth, which is a human health hazard. One that comes to mind is the willow-leafed oak from North America, Quercus phellos. That is a beaut. I'm passionate about lime trees, and I don't mean for gin and tonics, but the Tilia species, or lindens as they call them in America. These are big trees. There's about 90, I think, maybe 70 species of lime, and they've all got a bad press because of one species, and maybe it's two parents. It's a hybrid. It's the one you see in London, and that attracts aphids, and the aphids drop honeydew, and the honeydew gets colonised by sooty mould, and that lands on your car. But that's only one species and maybe the two parents to an extent. But the range of lime trees out there, that's just so wonderful. And if you've got a big garden, I would look up different unusual species of lime. The silver pendant lime, Tilia tomentosa, Henry's lime, which actually isn't that big, but has a beautiful leaf, Tilia henryana. I could go on, but I think limes are a little bit undervalued. Look at some of the more unusual oaks, and what about yew trees and some of the other American and Chinese varieties of trees. Many of ginkgo biloba, my word. It's a dinosaur tree. It was around with the dinosaurs. It doesn't have any pests and diseases. It makes a fantastic avenue or parkland tree. Beautiful autumn colour and as tough as old boots.
I get asked this question a lot as well from customers. They have maybe annoying neighbours they want to shield. What would be a really good tree for them to put in to do that?
Well, there is now the High Hedges Act, which means that local authorities sadly have to judge the rows between neighbours, mainly after leyland cypress trees have been planted as hedging and the neighbour who planted them hasn't cut them back, and they don't like being cut back if they're left for ages. Leyland cypress is a great tree, but not on a neighbour's boundary. There's one at Wakehurst Place down the road, which is now probably 35 metres high. And that's not very sort of friendly. It's anti-social behaviour, really. One of the things that I'm finding with clients in London especially is pleached trees. So you can plant a hedge and keep that at 2 metres, but then if you plant pleached trees along just in front of the hedge, and basically they're like 2-dimensional squares of foliage, probably only about 18, 28 inches wide, and they can be clipped. So it's a hedge on stilts. It's a hedge on a stem. And that is not a bad way of creating privacy in a friendly way.
Right.
And up to, if say you've got a 2 metre hedge, and then you could have another 2 metres of the pleached tree above, so that you've got 4 metres, which I think is enough for everyone. You can get especially lime, hornbeam and beech as in pleached form. So if you Google pleaching or pleached trees, you'll see there's a really wide range out there.
I'm trying to get a lot of scent into my garden. What's a good tree for scent?
One of the things to remember is if you're going to be planting a largest tree, then the scent might be above you in a way, with the wind. So, one of the biggest ways of getting scent in the garden is with shrubs. That's one big thing that they offer us. But if I was to choose one in particular, it would be Cordyline australis, which is from New Zealand, and it's a palm. Well, it's not a palm, but it's related to palms, and it has sort of strap-like foliage, often multi-stemmed. But then these huge flower clusters are produced, and I often see people sort of sniffing the air and trying to work out what the smell is. The flowers may be 4 metres, 5 metres up, but it's just such an amazing scent and very, very powerful. So New Zealand cabbage tree, I think the common name is Cordyline australis, would be easily my first choice.
Okay. And what would be your favourite tree for flowers?
I've got one in the garden which I was a little bit doubtful whether it was going to do well, but it's done really well. It's not a big tree. It's okay for small gardens. It's got very attractive, quite large, wide leaves. And the flowers are white and slightly scented. They flower in June, July. And it's called the epaulet tree because the flower panicles hang down and actually look like the sort of scrambled egg that some generals will have on their epaulets. The Latin name is a bit of a pain, but it's Pterostyrax with a silent P. So it's Pterostyrax, and the species name is Hispida. So that's a really nice summer flowering small tree. And it is available, but you do have to hunt it down. Not the average garden centre will stock it. That would be my first choice.
Okay. And what would be your first choice for autumn colour? Again, if I had to make you narrow it down.
That's a difficult one as well. I think the first thing as far as autumn colour is concerned, autumn colour trees probably do well with a bit more shelter. Otherwise, the wind will just blow the foliage off. So a sheltered spot best for autumn colour. If you've got a big garden, then the North American tulip tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, or the North American sweet gum, which is liquid amber, Styraciflua, they would be easily my first two choices. But in a smaller garden, there's a thing called the Persian ironwood. There's a fastigiate version of it, and it's a small garden tree or shrub with very reliable autumn colour.
Yeah,
and the nursery I mentioned and some other nurseries are now growing it on a single stem.
Yeah.
So really good.
Yeah, that's a really lovely tree. And if I had a seaside garden?
Yeah. The location of the garden is crucial. I mean, if you're right on the coast, then you need like a front line windbreak. But if you're a mile inland, then it's not quite so bad and the range is more available. If you drive along the coast, the south coast of England, for example, you'll see quite not a wide range of trees being used for frontline planting. Again, it can get quite tall. People say it's a shrub, but it can become a tree, and that's tamarisk. Mm-hmm. A lovely plant with either pink flowers in the spring or pink flowers in the summer, depending on the variety you go for. I've just come back from Cornwall and seen some tamarisk which are 4 or 5 metres high, and they act as a really good windbreak. On a larger scale, the evergreen oak from the Mediterranean, holm oak, is one of the toughest and some of the pines, but you need some space for that. I mean, you can pleach holm oak, but they're big trees. Sycamore even. A lot of people don't like sycamore, but it's one of the toughest trees that we can grow in this country. You're going to get scorch on the coastal side, so don't expect these trees to look immaculate facing the coast, but it's what it does for your garden, which is to enable you to grow a wider range of plants because you're protecting them from the salt and the sand and the wind.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much indeed, Peter Thurman. What an absolutely brilliant source of information he is. It's always a joy to hear him speak about trees because I think his expertise and passion for them is so evident. I really hope you enjoyed that interview. I know I enjoyed recording it. Peter mentioned a couple of things. He spoke about removing one of the leaders if you have a tree that has two leaders. The leader is the main upright stem of the tree. If you find the main stem forks at some point and there are two leaders, you can remove the one that is growing more laterally if you want that tree to have a more upright growth habit. I also asked Peter what would be his choice of tree for a large garden, and I said I knew what mine would be. And in case you're interested, when I get my French chateau, I'll be planting a cedar of Lebanon on my front lawn. Now, just before you go, you might have picked up on the fact that not only did Peter recommend products you shouldn't buy, he also recommended a cheap and cheerful plant food that you probably have in your kitchen cupboard. I'm hoping to save you money by bringing you information about things you can do to be more successful in your garden and with your plants, but also to help you avoid wasting money on unnecessary products and also practices. So, if you feel like this episode has helped save you time or money, perhaps you would consider donating half the price of that packet of mycorrhizal fungi you didn't buy to my Patreon account. That way we both win. If you'd like to make a one-off donation or even subscribe, please go to patreon.com/rootsandall. So thank you as always for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday.
For more information, visit the Roots and All website at rootsandall.co.uk. To download more episodes, visit iTunes, your favourite podcast provider, or get them direct from our website.